Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's HDI webinar, New Change Manager Survival Guide. Today's webinar is brought to you by HDI, where technical support professionals belong. I'm Roy Atkinson, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. First of all, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please refresh your browser. It fixes just about everything. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during this webcast, and they will be answered during the Q&A session toward the end. You can download the slides from today's presentation by opening the Attachments tab on your BrightTalk screen. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. Remember that today's webinar will be available on demand shortly after the completion of this live webcast, and you'll receive an email reminder to let you know it is available. Remember that you can stay in touch with HDI on Twitter at @ThinkHDI, and we have a Twitter chat every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific time on Twitter. Different topic every week. Please join us. We're also on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And our members-only community at HDI Connect is a great source of information, a place to ask questions and share with your peers. Today's speaker is Greg Sanker, who is an IT service management blogger, speaker, and practitioner with over 30 years of global IT experience, ranging from a Fortune 10 technology giant to the public sector. He's managed service management office, network operations, application development, service desk, and support operations. His professional focus is on helping organizations achieve excellence in IT service management. He lives in the Pacific Northwest of the USA, where stunning natural beauty and high tech form a unique lifestyle. In his spare time, Greg hikes, bikes, and plays a bit of blues guitar, or a blit of blues guitar, whichever. He blogs about excellence in IT service management at itsmtransition.com. He once said on a podcast with regard to IT service management, "I make mistakes all day and I write about it at night." So please welcome our featured speaker today, Greg Sanker.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hopefully you can all hear me. I was getting a little bit of audio distortion as Roy was introducing. If you do, please just comment in the messaging section. So today we are going to talk about change management, and I promised a crash course on change management. And so it's going to go pretty fast, and I'm highlighting just those elements that my experience has told me that you need to experience in your first 90 days. You need to become versant on these topics right away to be successful. So yes, there's a lot more body of knowledge around change management, and there's lots of good sources for getting that. So today we're going to talk about what is change management, because there seems to be as many definitions as there are people who define. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why you're here. What did you get yourself into? Why are we talking about change management in this crash course? And then we talk a little bit about what results your stakeholders are expecting. We're going to define some terms that you might hear a little bit, talk a little bit about the basic process, talk about roles of change management, and then we'll get into some of the challenge that you face in my view on how you should do that. So let's talk about what change management is. Well, first of all, you'll notice that I talk about it as an organizational capability, not necessarily as a process, because it involves processes, but ultimately it's the capability that your organization uses to move you from an idea that the business wants and to a value-producing change that's been implemented in the live environment. So for that capability, we're trying to do these things here. We're talking first and foremost about timely and effective implementation of things that the business requires. And we have to manage risk along the way, obviously. And we want to minimize negative impact to the business. We also want to make sure that we actually achieve those outcomes. More than just get the thing implemented, we want to make sure that the business experience the outcomes that they're looking for. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we also have, many of us, governance and compliance expectations around change management, so we need to make sure that we meet all of those. All right? So that's my definition of change management. Let's talk about what did you sign up for? And there's three main categories that I talk to of people who want to know about this level of change management. One, you've been asked to take over an existing program for some reason, right? So you're the new change manager. There's an existing program in place. And secondly, you might be asked to start a new program from scratch where maybe your organization doesn't have change management, or it's very immature and you're being asked to bring that up from the very beginning, right? And then finally, you might be called upon to fix a broken change management thing. And if that's the case, you have unique challenges to you as well. So those are the three kind of typical use cases for somebody that's looking at, I need to understand change management. I need to do it pretty quickly. So let's talk about the challenges of those three engagement models. If you have an existing program, you need to be asking a lot of questions because you need to know what game you're playing, right? So asking questions like, what do you think is working, what is not working, and where do we need improvements? Those are the kind of questions. But make sure that you're asking them of the right people, right? Because if you ask yourself or the person who asked you to take on your change program, you might get very different answers than if you engage the people who are actually managing the changes, or the customers or other stakeholders out there that are involved with change management. So you want to be talking to a lot of people to get kind of to the heart of the matter of what is happening with change management. And be especially mindful that there's always the official answer, and then there's the word on the street answer. And if there's any way for you to get into the folks that will tell you, look, this is what we really think about change management, or this is how we actually do change management here, that's what you need to know, because you're playing to win. You want to be successful, and you usually have a relatively short order to start order of time to start producing value for your stakeholders, and which is important to know who are the key players involved with this change management that I'm being asked to do. And you mustn't assume that they're the usual cast of characters, right? There might be other people involved with change management that you don't know. In fact, there might be workflows of change management that are happening in the organization, key decision makers, people who are responsible for doing changes that you may not know about and others in your organization might know about as well. So there's a lot of deep diving and a lot of questions that need to be asked. And we'll put together a game plan a little bit later. So if you're starting from scratch, if you have no formal change management in your organization, then you've signed up for a very different challenge. It can be an exciting one, but you need to ask yourself, so why is it that I'm being asked to implement change management now? And it usually means something went wrong. Oftentimes, there's a highly visible customer impacting or organizational impacting incident, or as I like to say, usually one too many, and then the CIO puts the call out, I want change management and I want it now. So you need to start understanding, so what exactly went wrong? And who is it that's actually asking for change management? Is it the business that's asking the CIO to better manage change? Is it the IT managers themselves? Is it the line staff? Who is actually asking you to start implementing change management, and why? The question behind the question. You say you want change management, but I need to understand what it is that you're expecting from change management, that you think that change management is the answer to your question there. All right? And so because you're starting from scratch, and because usually there's kind of this cultural error of what really happened is there is some outcome that your stakeholders are anticipating out of your change program, right? And so we want to focus on achieving that outcome, or those outcomes that actually have tangible value to your customers, and not focus on the process piece. Now, I'm not an anti-process. I have my ITIL certifications, and I could show you the processes, right? I could lead you through that. But frankly, that's rather the easy part of implementing a change program. It's the culture, the customers, and all the interactions with other people out there that are going to prove to be your greatest challenge, right? So keep in mind that if you're starting from scratch, make sure you're very, very clear at what outcomes your stakeholders are desiring out of your change program. And lastly, if you've been called to fix some kind of ding-a-darn change management program, similarly, there's a reason. Why is it that I'm being called to fix change management? What happened, or what has been happening, or what do you perceive as the problem? And here there's an extra challenge of extricating the reality from the perception, because oftentimes if you have a change management program in place, chances are good it's producing some certain value. But there's some side effects or some deficiencies that are being noted by some folks that are frustrated, right? So you want to make sure that you're addressing both the reality of the situation and the perception, because if you respond to the perceptions, you may actually be trumping on something that's good, that's in place. Likewise, if you're responding to the reality, you may not be addressing what it is that people perceive to be the challenge. And so those are challenging aspects of heading out on this. Now, bear in mind that there's going to be a cultural minefield, right? So there's going to be sacred cows that you might run into, and there might be not so sacred cow pies that you'll step into as you move forward through the process. So just be mindful that the culture understands quote-unquote change management as it exists in your organization. And they all have their predisposed view of what that is, both good, bad, and indifferent. And there's probably also a subculture about how do you work around or through or in spite of change management. This is just a reality that you face because, again, when you go off to ITIL training, they tell you how it's supposed to work. They don't know how it works in your organization. They don't even know how it should be working in your organization. That's what your job is, right? And then the other thing is that you want to really kind of understand what my role is. Am I the hired gun? Was I brought in specifically to fix this thing, come what may? There might be frustrations with the previous change manager, and we want a new change manager that acts more like we want. Or gives us more of what we want, or is less rigid, or is more rigid. So understand what is being asked of you. And then also, you really want to be mindful of what are those pain points. So what's wrong with the current change capability? Is it not producing the right results? Is it not effectively managing risk? And by pain point, it really is, this is the bad things that happen, or at least we're perceiving that they're related to poor change management, but they could actually be associated with other deficiencies in your organization that change management actually can't fix. So there might be deficiencies in your release process, there might be deficiencies in the development or the technical architecture or technical debt in your infrastructure, and other issues that investing in change management really isn't actually going to address. So you really want to make sure you understand what the actual pain points are, and then determine why does it need to be fixed, and also especially, well, what does fixed look like? What does it look like when this thing is fixed to your stakeholders, right? All right, so that's the three main engagement models, and you might be one of those. I'm expecting that you probably are. So first and foremost, out of the gate, regardless of which three of those engagement models, is you want to manage expectations, and here's why. Everybody has something that they think change management will do for them, or that they want change management to do less of, leave me more alone, or do more of, right? So if you don't really deeply understand and manage those expectations, well, then those expectations can relatively grow without bound or be of such a high nature that there's no way that you can meet them. And then if that's the case, then, of course, obviously, you won't be successful no matter what you do. So manage expectations. So what can your stakeholders expect? What can IT staff expect to be different or to change, or how does it impact them? How does it impact your customers? Will they see more changes done faster? Will they see less changes done slower? What will senior management see? What tangible kind of results will they see, right? And you want to be able to present a message that where people will understand what's in it for me. So for IT staff, if they're allowed to believe that change management is going to make it harder and slower to deliver value, and then you're going to have to sit in marathon meetings just to get your minor change implemented, it's going to be hard to get them on board. They're not going to see that as value to them. Likewise, if your customers are told, well, too bad if you turn in your change, the day after the change advisory meeting, well, then you're going to have to wait a week until the next meeting, and it's really not adding any value. We just have to wait. That's just the way it is. They're not going to see that as value adding to them. So be explicit about what your stakeholders can expect from your change management program. And likewise, when we're talking about outcomes, the typical change management program or process talks about measuring the nuts and bolts of the process, and that's a good thing. But if we really want to focus in on the outcomes that our change program is actually producing, then we need to measure what matters to our stakeholders or to our customers. So if for instance, one of the one of the reasons for wanting to invest in change management is because we want to reduce the number of significant change-related outages. Well, then we should probably measure how much downtime is associated with major changes and so on and so forth. So make sure you're measuring those things that your customer actually cares about, right? And you want to set realistic expectations because they're going to want the moon, right? And we're going to actually be able to deliver them some baby steps towards that, one small step towards the moon, right? So, and we want to make sure that whatever those steps are that we do, that we're focusing in on the pain points and we have some very short-term goals so that they see what we're doing, and that's a kind of a reminder to them to understand that this is what we're actually setting out to do, and here's the progress that we're making. That's why, reporting regularly, or as I like to say, early and often, tell them what you're doing. This is what we set out to do. This is how we're measuring it, and this is how we did, last week, last month, and this is what we're going to be doing next week, next month, sort of thing. So that's helping you manage expectations. And the reason I point this out isn't because it's self-evident. Is because these are the things that really hamper successful change programs. You know that an alarming number of change programs, very sincere change programs that are attempted by people who know what they're doing and are very familiar with change management, don't produce the value or are abandoned after a relatively short order of time. And the reason isn't because the guidance is bad or ITIL is bad or service management or change management or all these externalities are bad. It's because you face cultural and expectation mismatches. And these are the things that will kill your change program. So you really have to focus on this. Again, I call this a survival guide because this is how you be successful in actually producing the value that your customers are asking you to produce. So let's define a few terms. You've heard these terms, and many of them are kind of definitions, but let's define them so that we have a working knowledge of them. So the first one is the request for change, the infamous RFC, as those of us in change management like to call it. And it's a three-letter acronym that makes you sound like you're really familiar with change management. But really, all that is it's a record for managing the life cycle of a change, or tracking it through the entire process from the very beginning to the value that you produce at the end. And right, so it contains fields. Now, it could be a Word document, it could be a Post-it note, it could be an Excel spreadsheet, or it could be a database, or it could be an ITSM tool. It really doesn't matter. Conceptually, you just need to understand that an RFC is a collection of data and information about a change that's been going from being proposed to being implemented and tested and accepted by the customer and is producing value. So it tracks things like, the who, what, when, why, where, what exactly the change is, what it is that we're doing, at a high level. It should have fairly detailed implementation plan, test plans, rollback plans, all the nuts and bolts of how do we actually intend to do this. And it needs to be at sufficient detail that your technical reviewers can actually understand what it is that you're saying that you're going to do, but also be something that your perhaps non-technical or business-related users can look at that and say, I understand what you're doing, and I have a feeling that it's going to do what I want it to do, right? Should include a communications plan, and you notice at the end there I said it should document what outcomes we're expecting to produce. And just so you know, those outcomes really should be in business language. They should be in business value language, because every change that we do it on behalf of the business, which of course, the counter argument is, well, just upgrading software and applying patches and that kind of stuff, that's not really business related. But it actually is, because the business has an expectation that we will maintain our environment to a certain security level, to a certain stability level. So it's in support of business outcomes like we want stable platforms, right? And then the other thing is it's not a static document. It's something that gets updated as the change progresses. And so not the least of which is the status is updated as it moves from proposed to in progress to approved to completed to successful, et cetera. All these kind of things so that you can look at it to kind of track where it is. And it just helps everybody to say, well, where is that change? How did it go? What happened? Did we actually implement it, right? All right, so that's enough RFCs. Let's talk about change types. The first change type is a normal change, and this is pretty self-evident because most changes are quote-unquote normal, and they go through the CAB process. They're reviewed and approved or rejected, and they're moved into production, right? So it's typically, after it's reviewed, a normal change typically approved by the change manager or some other change authority, and it depends how you're structured in your organization. And I'm not going to get into that, but the change manager makes sure that it's been approved by the appropriate authority. It's important to note that change management should not be perceived simply as a last check. It should be engaged as soon as you know that there's a change to be made. So it could be weeks or months in advance. Anything that's a project that's going to ultimately make a change in the production environment, that's a change, and you should file an RFC as soon as possible, and that would be a normal change. And so you can put it on the list saying we're going to review this, in 2 months or whatever. And you want to make sure that most of your changes are this type. If you're managing your business well, most changes should be normal changes. That's something that you want to do. We're going to talk about emergency changes. I know you're expecting me to get to that, and we will. But first, let's talk about standard changes. Normal and standard, in English, those sound about very similar. But standard changes in change management parlance is very, very different. These are changes that are very low risk, they're performed frequently, and they either can or do follow a documented process. And that's the difference. Those three things right there kind of define what could or should be a standard change. So if you have changes that are done very frequently, so for instance, a new user in your Active Directory technically is a change, right? But you certainly don't want to file an RFC and wait a week to add a user or add a group or something like that. But it does have some risk. It's relatively low risk. And it should, if it follows a documented process, be something that you can do as needed. And that's exactly what the standard change is for. So the process, once it's documented, that process is reviewed by your CAB. And once it's approved, then it's something that can be done as needed in daily operations. Doesn't require any additional oversight from change management or the CAB or the change manager. It just simply is used in operations. Do keep in mind, though, that once a standard change is approved, it still is under the authority of your change management structure. So if a standard change or standard changes start producing unwanted issues in production, that approval can be revoked and revisited by the CAB or the change manager if they feel like we're not effectively managing risk associated with those standard changes. So keep in mind that it still has its authority given through the change management process. And by the way, one of the things that so many existing change programs, one of the things where people find a lot of frustration, and if you're being asked to fix a change program, this might be you, is where too small of changes are coming to CAB every week, and we all know that that's a tremendous waste of time. And standard changes are one of those ways where you can push those down as close to the people that are doing the work as possible. You're still managing risk, but you're not hampering the business. So keep this in mind. That's something that you should be thinking of fairly regularly. All right, emergency changes. We all know the term emergency change, but let me put some guidance around this, because how you define emergency changes, especially early in your change program or as you're trying to mature your change program, can significantly impact how people perceive change management. So I'm going to tell you the way I believe it should be, which is consistent with the best practices within the industry. And if your organization sees it otherwise, then you may want to be swaying gently over time to be more in alignment with what I'm proposing here, because it saves you a lot of heartache and hassle. If your organization has a strong emergency change process, chances are good you're not going to be able to change it, so you just want to embrace it as best you can. But look, it should be reserved for something that is both high impact and high urgency. And typically it's something that has a lot of impact on the company. Threat to life or limb, significant financial loss, public perception, compliance issues or law enforcement. Issues where the company is really on notice of this is a major issue. Typically it'll be handled as a major incident with a major incident. If you have a very mature incident process, I strongly encourage tying those two together. But once you've identified an emergency change and believe that it really is a change, it's following an abbreviated review process. You're not bypassing the process, you're simply following a streamlined process. And part of the reason that we do that is because the risk is still there, but you need to understand that we're accepting perhaps a higher level of risk because we're making a change in minutes or hours as opposed to days to plan and test and all that, because there's this enormity of risk that we're trying to alleviate by this, right? But one of the things that emergency changes frequently do is they become a safety valve for bad planning, right? You've heard the saying, a lack of planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency change on my part, right? And that's a nice standard to go by, but you set yourself up for a battle when your organization has allowed emergency changes to become a safety valve for process deficiencies, planning deficiencies, or other organizational aberrations. And then you redefine emergency as simply, well, we didn't plan very well and the customer is going to suffer, so let's put this in. You want to make sure that you're keeping them to an absolute minimum. And to do that, if you raise the bar high enough where your organization perceives triggering an emergency change as being tantamount to calling 911 or hitting the fire alarm and evacuating a building, that this demands immediate attention that can't wait. And so you want your requesters to kind of ask themselves, does this really rise to the level of an emergency change or not? And self-limit it so that you don't get to be the bad guy all the time and is associated with that. But on the other hand, a change program that's implemented that doesn't have provision for emergency changes is going to be quickly viewed as being irrelevant when things really, really matter. It's like step aside, let the adults take over here. You don't want that. You want your change program to be able to accommodate real emergency changes. And it's something that you can manage over time, especially if you have an existing program or a culture that perhaps is misusing emergency changes as I've defined them, as generally defined, then it's something that you want to migrate over time. You might want to keep track of the amount of or percentage of your changes that are emergencies and set some goals for reducing that over time. All right, let's talk about the CAB. So the CAB is the Change Advisory Board. I highlight advisory because I've often heard CAB referred to as the Change Approval Board. I've also heard CAB referred to as things that I can't repeat in polite company. But it is the advisory board, and they are focused on managing risk. So they're reviewing changes for risk and potential negative impact. They're reviewing to see if the proposed change is likely to achieve the outcomes that is requested. They're looking at things like scheduling conflicts, resource conflicts. Are we upgrading the network at the same time we're trying to update servers or patch servers, that kind of stuff. And at the end, the CAB's role is to advise, using their skills and knowledge, the change program whether we should approve or reject a change, right? So they are advisory in nature, and they advise the change manager, who may be the change authority, or there may be higher levels of change authority that would look to the advice of the CAB on the change. All right? So that's some definitions that you need to get past. You failed changes, that's an ever popular one. I make a distinction, and I'll go through this really quick. It's a change that didn't go as planned, it didn't produce the results expected. It might have caused problems in other part of the infrastructure, or just simply didn't pass the acceptance testing at the end. These are all various reasons why a change could be considered a failed change, even if the customer simply isn't happy with the results. We don't like it. It didn't do what we want, or we don't think it's right. Those are failed changes. Typically are rolled back, but they don't have to be. Those are two different things typically. Again, these are terms that are frequently used in various ways. This is the standard definition of a failed change. So just because a change is failed doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be rolled back. The business might say, well, it didn't produce the results, but there's enough good value in it that we don't want the impact of rolling back, so we're going to stick with this change even though it didn't produce the results. Those are possible scenarios, but there's also an implication in what I just said, and that is ultimately it's up to the business. Did they get what they wanted out of this? So you want to make sure that your business is engaged in that, right? So then let's talk about rollback changes. So if the change was either fully or partly implemented, and then we decided to back it out or return it to its pre-change state, then that is a rollback change. And it could be because it didn't have the functionality, or it could even be because you have a change window that's defined and it's not going to get completed in that period of time. So one of the decisions that you could make if you're operating under that constraint would be, let's roll it back and we'll do it in a different time window or ask for a larger time window. And ultimately it could be a business decision. The business could decide for any reason that we need to roll that back. And I can feel the energy in the room here is like, well, so does the business get to weigh in on whether we unpatch a server or take a security patch off? Probably not. That's not the kind of thing that we would want to consult them on. However, we would want to say, okay, we've patched our servers, let us know if you see any impact, and the next morning we were seeing significant slowdown of business processes that we believe might be related to that change, right? So that might be a situation where we consider rolling it back or consider it a failed change. All right, so let's move into change windows. I talked about that a little bit. Change windows are prearranged timeframes that you do changes in. It's kind of self-explanatory. Not always self-explanatory. Is it something that you want to pre-negotiate with your business and your stakeholders? You want to have these established as early in the process of rolling out services as possible, because you want people to associate these change windows with a positive thing. We're doing maintenance, we're adding feature, good things are happening during the change window. Often they're going to be targeted on various pieces of technology or parts of the infrastructure. So for instance, and please don't write this down and quote me on this, but you might say network changes are made Friday night from 6 to midnight, and server or infrastructure changes are made Sunday morning 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. or things like that. But you can do that within your organization, and in many cases that makes a great deal of sense. Make sure that whatever length of time you agree to, that it's long enough for most changes that you typically would do for that kind of technology, or however you've broken it down, or that you're able to go sufficiently to the point where you decide this isn't going well, we're not going to get it done, and we roll it completely back to its pre-change state. You want to make sure that your windows are big enough to do both. And often you'll implement a go, no-go checkpoint within the change window, like halfway or three-quarters or whatnot, and make a decision. Does it look like we're going to make it? Yes, no, continue, or roll back, whatever, right? And so I did talk about establishing them earlier for the perception. If you have service level documentation, service level with your customers, get that documented in there. The service is unavailable, midnight to 3 a.m. on Sunday or whatever that happens to be. Make sure you get it in there, again, because you want them to have a positive perception about change windows and not say, oh great, the service is down yet again. I'll bet they're fixing all the errors that they made last week, kind of stuff. You want to make it positive, right? All right, so, and that takes us into the process. Now, you're going to really love this, especially if you're process people, because here is how life works in most organizations. Now, whether you're a 6-person organization or you have 600 IT staff in a multinational corporation, you have something that looks like this. Somewhere over here, you have changes that are being built, coded, tested, whatever. Changes happen over here. And then over to the right, you have the live environment. And somewhere you go from, okay, we know what we're doing, we know what we want to do, we're going to move that into the live environment, and we want to make sure that we screw it in when we install it, not screw it up, right? So that's the basic process flow, and you should recognize this in most organizations. The one caveat that somebody always raises their hand is that we don't have a test and we don't have a dev, we do all of our stuff in the live environment, in which case, well, you still kind of have that process that basically says before you start making changes to the live environment, you've made a decision to implement a change, and you probably ought to have a pretty good idea of how you're going to back that out, right? So here's what we're really, in its most simplistic form, is that all we're doing is we're taking a moment to take a look at the changes as they go into the live environment, adding a little bit of diligence to make sure that we don't cause problems in the production environment. And when you're first getting started with change management, this adds a lot of value, because you find that by getting your smart people together and saying, okay, Tuesday at 2 o'clock we're going to, do this thing, somebody invariably at the meeting will go, well, you realize that's the time when the business is closing their books. That's a pretty lousy time to do that. Or, hey, that's the same time we're doing this. Or, hey, are you sure that version that you're upgrading to is compatible with the operating system or the database it connects to? Those are the kind of questions that were just like, oh, wow, I'm glad we stopped to check that. That's actually not going to work so well. That's the value of this reactive change process between here. Now, keep in mind, though, that if you build this into a stopping point, a silo, and I'm going to make a couple of side comments here, is by the very nature, if you think in terms of systems or theory of constraints, if you're familiar with it, I've just said that we're going to stack all of our changes up and we're going to review them once a week. And by saying that, I've just defined a bottleneck in our process. I've just told you that the cab stands as a bottleneck between your changes being developed and in the live environment. And so you want to optimize any constraints in your system, as you know, from the theory of constraints, right? So as you start focusing in on change management, try to get involved as early as possible. And if I drew this picture in a little more detail, there'd be another magnifying glass over to the left. But before we actually start doing any work, we want to look at that and say, is this approach going to produce the results that we want? Do we know how we're going to test it? Do we know what the user acceptance is and all that sort of stuff? And then what you have is more of a flow. And if you get involved with DevOps or any of the kind of the modern thinking around methodologies, is you want to think in process flow and not in waterfall stair steps going downstream. So I'm not espousing a big halt to the work where we take time to review 300 changes. We really want to optimize the process as much as possible. But in its most essential form, that's what change management is. So let's make sure we don't send something down the line that's going to cause problems. Let's talk a little bit about roles. Now, you're going to be playing some of these roles, and you're familiar with these, but let's just go through these real quick, right? Change manager, many of you on the phone are probably change managers, are new change managers, or you know the poor change manager, and this is what the job is. It is the day-to-day tasks associated with managing changes within your organization. You're coordinating all changes. You're making sure they're flowing well. One of the things that role does is they do a preliminary review of the request for change, and they look at it to make sure it's complete, make sure that it makes sense, make sure that it accurately describes and has enough information that your CAB will be able to make a good choice, but also to make sure that you have the right subject matter experts available to review that change. So, for instance, if your CAB doesn't normally involve your security folks or your deep network folks, and you have a change that's associated with a firewall upgrade or reviewing firewall policies or something like that, is you'd want to make sure that those folks are involved with that review. So one of the things that the change manager does is make sure that the right expertise is there at the table doing part of the review. Now, obviously, you facilitate the CAB meetings. There's a process associated with that. My preference is a very informal process that's led by the change manager. I've seen CABs where it's like a committee meeting where you have to raise your hand to speak and there's voting and all that sort of stuff. It's very old school. I wouldn't recommend doing that at all. I would view it more as a scrum team that's trying to move stuff forward quickly and is collaborating for the greater good of let's get these changes out, let's get it done quickly, but let's make sure that it's done at high quality. So one of the last roles of the change manager is to make sure that changes are reviewed and approved or rejected by the appropriate authority, and then we move them on down the line. Right? So that's your change manager. Here's some easier ones. The change requester is the person who requests the change. But it's a little bit more than that. They take on a shepherding responsibility to take that request from the inception all the way through the end, right? So they're responsible to make sure that they've documented what it is that we're trying to do and what we're expecting to see out of it. They're responsible for answering questions from the change manager or from the CAB itself about the change. They typically sit at the CAB when a change is being reviewed to represent that change. And either has the information or is able to provide the information that the CAB may want to know about that change. And it may or may not be the same person as the person who's actually going to do the change. In small organizations, they typically are. In large organizations, they may not be. Sometimes you'll have a project manager be a change requester, or a team lead, or a line supervisor or somebody like that might actually be the requester. And then somebody else does the, watch this transition, is the change implementer, are typically the technical staff who are actually doing the hands-on work. And there can be more than one person, of course. If there's multiple pieces of the change, there might be a network component, there might be a server component, might be a software component. So any of the folks that are associated with actually doing the change, they're change implementers. They all have some level of responsibility for real-time progress reporting on how is the change going. So, for instance, I talked about having a go, no-go kind of meeting or checkpoint through a change window. As the implementers would, of course, say, we're halfway there, it's looking good, I think we're going to make it, or, it's taken us 2 hours to do what should have taken 2 minutes, I'm really concerned, I don't think we're going to get it in place. So the change implementers are providing that level of detail during the change implementation. All right, so the CAB, they typically meet once a week. I talked about that. That is the point where you actually formally review proposed changes. By the way, it is not required that you have a CAB. It's not required that the CAB meets in person. It's not required that they meet weekly. They could meet hourly. They could meet daily. They could meet monthly. I know I just blew some of your mind, but the best practices don't require that these things actually happen in the traditional way that most of us think about it. So if you have the opportunity to start your change program from scratch or materially improve your change process, consider what actually meets the needs of your organization. Don't assume that you have to do a CAB the way you did it at your former company or when you were in college or whatever. Don't assume that that's the way that you need to do it in your current organization. So the CAB is made up of subject matter experts and key decision makers. So there's usually, like your senior network people, your senior software app dev people, your security people, your line, your network manager and your infrastructure manager, those kind of folks that are typically there who are the movers and the shakers about what does and doesn't happen within your organization. You want them to be empowered and you want them to be at a high degree of knowledge about their technical expertise. And they're expected to use that expertise to make sure that the outcomes are actually had. And that's an important point that I'm actually going to slow down and talk about just a little bit. I've seen CABs where it's like the Apollo 13 missions where, each section had to weigh in on their slice of the pie, network or we go, infrastructure or we go. I don't prefer that methodology because our world is vastly too complex nowadays. Our technical architectures are way, way too complex that we can't silo out or fragment our review of changes. So somebody who's serving the role of the network subject matter expert may actually have deep knowledge of how certain software components behave on the network and be able to provide advice of is that the best architecture or is that the best approach. So don't silo off or segment out your expertise on your CAB. Everybody there is expected to do everything in their power to make sure changes are successful. All right, let's see. Let's talk about some of the challenges. And if you've been doing change management, you've probably seen some of these elements at work. But I'm going to tell you that the challenges of change management, and you're starting to see a theme develop here, isn't so much the process. If you're expecting me to show the swim lane process flow diagram, which I have lots of copies of and I'm very familiar with, you're going to be disappointed because here's the thing. A very, very basic change program that's accepted in the culture and that's adapted to meet the culture is going to be vastly more superior in producing outcomes than the best engineered process that doesn't meet the needs of your organization. And you've heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, the reason that's true is because every change, every process, everything that we do in service management or IT service delivery happens in the context of the culture in which we're trying to implement it, right? So we're trying to manage changes within a culture. And that culture might be friendly to that idea. They might be hostile to that idea. They may have a practice around, the culture may have a practice around how we manage change, and you, Mr. Change Manager, are messing that up. And so you're going to be viewed as damaging something that they see as valuable, right? So remember that culture is simply a collection of behaviors that are considered acceptable within the culture. So pushing out ideas that they feel are dangerous to the environment may be an accepted behavior, and so you're being treated exactly the way the culture would expect, right? So however you justify or whatever objectives you set for what we want to do with our change management program has to fit inside of that culture. And that's where you, more than any outside consultant or even me in your organization, you have to be the one that determines how it fits and how we're going to adjust it. So you really have to understand what the challenges and concerns are and what the cultural expectations are around processes and changes, and you have to adapt the best practices to fit within your cultural context and so that it'll be palatable to the folks with whom you're working. And you also have to communicate. And if I were, a cool communicator, I put communicate, 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 because you can't over-communicate around change, especially when you're changing how things have been done. Here's the reality is you understand what needs to be done, or you will by the time you start taking action. But just because you understand it doesn't mean the culture instantly understands it, right? So you have to talk to people about what it is that you're doing. And the other thing is relationships. Again, very un-IT-ish and very unprocessed, but if you don't establish and build relationships with all of the key stakeholders out there, you're unlikely to produce any meaningful results with your change program. You might engineer a fantastic process that won't produce the value because the culture isn't accepting it. So you need to get out there and you need to meet with everybody that's impacted by or has an opinion about or feelings about change management. You need to meet them where they exist. My favorite is the coffee chat, but that's an awful lot of coffee when you're joining an organization and have to meet with lots and lots of stakeholders. But when you do that, your goal is to speak as little as I possibly can and listen as much as I'm able. Because you want to, I know what I think about change management and I know what my vision is for change management, but I don't know what your concerns are and your constraints are and the things that you're facing, right? So I want to make sure that I'm understanding their concerns. And here's some dirty little secrets of change management. They're all out there, right? So you know darn well that change management is slow and bureaucratic. We've worked for decades, those of us that have been doing this for a while, to earn that reputation, not intentionally, of course, but it's a reputation we have, and it's out there. Everybody knows that, right? And the other one is that the change manager is everyone's best friend, or as my friend Doug Tedder once told me, actually the change manager has no friends. Because it's like being a politician. Everybody loves you until you vote for the wrong thing, and the wrong thing could be the other guy's change, right? Now the dirty secret is, if we could bypass change management, we so would. We would absolutely bypass you in a heartbeat, right? And high-risk changes are happening all the time in your environment, whether you know it or not. It really is happening out there. And there's one of the things that you're going to face is everybody thinks that we've tried this. You know, oh yeah, I remember back in, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, yeah, we did that change management thing. It didn't work. ITIL's a lark. All of this service management stuff is silly. We just do what we do, right? So these are things that the culture believes in many cases, right? And quite frankly, emergency changes are our secret weapon, and I'm not afraid to use it, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell my customer, the business, that change is ready, but the change manager over there, he tells me I have to wait a week, and I hit the panic button, and all of a sudden, you're the bad guy in the organization, right? There's the dirty little secret of change management. One of the other dirty little secrets is, in the wrong environment, change managers love the power associated with being able to say yes or no to changes. They love being able to do favors for their friends, and they love being able to obstruct other things, right? It's a power structure that doesn't belong in a modern IT organization, and that's why if you've been called to fix a change management program, you may be suffering in your organization from a power structure where they're amassing power within the change management as a, kind of a, go before the king and get his approval to move forward or not, right? And the last thing is that it's an organizational capability, not just a process. And every organization has their history, right? So we had change management. There might be cultural pushback because we've had a spotty history. It could be that people feel like there's a loss of autonomy or that you're being too rigid or structured. It just feels weird, right? So whatever the legacy of change management is within your organization, you need to embrace it. You really need to embrace what's there and see if you can leverage it. All right. Well, here's your game plan, and this actually flows very logically from what I just said. Focus on outcomes at the short term. Make sure you're addressing those pain points. You can write this down or download the slides because this literally is your checklist of this is what I'm setting out to do. Got to get the culture to buy in on it. I need to understand as much as I can about the concepts of the body knowledge around change management, but I really should be implementing much, much less than I'm capable of understanding because I want to build momentum and show value, and then we'll continue forward. It sounds like the CSI model, right? So I like to break it down into a 30, 60, 90-day game plan, right? So the first 30 days is all about getting to know the playing field, gathering information, building those relationships, and learning about change management, both change management as a practice and change management of how it's done in your organization. The next month, or for the 60 days, start identifying and prioritizing what incremental improvements you're going to go after, be communicating those, actually implement those improvements, and then revise and review the results and revise as needed. In other words, start that continual improvement ball rolling, but get some things in play in that next 60 days. And then by 90 days, by your 90-day checkpoint, you should be reporting on your results. You should be making sure that you're actively engaging people. If you've been successful, you'll have staff folding their arms and saying things like, well, if we're going to start doing change management, we really should start doing this, something that you know needs to be done, but we haven't started doing yet. And then you're using their energy to pull the change program forward. And of course, be prepared for course corrections. There will be course corrections. Plan for it. Embrace it. Because if you come in with all the answer, then there's nothing left for your people that you're working with to do. Give them an opportunity to get engaged by course correcting, right? And remember, this is supposed to be fun, right? That's why I've been doing this for so long. And I think, Roy, that takes us to our questions. So at this point, I'm going to take a deep breath and maybe a drink of water and let you see what we have in the queue for questions. See if we can stump me.
Okay, great job, Greg. Thank you. Here's a good one. You mentioned change proposal. Very briefly,
yes.
Is a change proposal really necessary? Would you limit proposals to a certain level of importance of change? I'm having a hard time showing the value of a change proposal to stakeholders in my organization, mostly because they want to go straight to RFC without first answering, can we or should we do this from a strategy point of view?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And my answer would be exactly as you say. I would avoid the change proposals for anything short of a very significant change, like implementation of a major new piece of technology or infrastructure component. And I know that that's the wrong answer, but in reality, you're going to have difficulty exactly as you described in your environment. Change proposals usually come way up into the governance kind of thing, like, you know, the can we afford to, do we have the capability, do we want to invest in the capability? So in most organizations, that's being handled formally or informally, either in your project management office, on your IT or organizational governance, or somehow you're going to get, these are the things that we want, and you're probably better suited to turn that into an RFC and manage it that way.
Great. Here's another one. We have moved standard changes out of change management and have requests for them. For example, build a VM server, not deploy it, just build it. Is that not a good idea? We review requests that cause issues in case they really aren't standard anymore.
That almost feels like a trick question, because the answer is absolutely, that is absolutely the right thing to do. That's exactly what you want to do. Building a VM, it essentially becomes a push-button request if you're doing it well, and if you're not, then it becomes a minor activity, but it's done the same way every time. That's the whole point of virtualizing your environment, right? So I would describe that as a very good use of a standard change that's implemented through the request process. That way you're logging it, you're documenting who's doing it, who's paying for it. You have the details there, but not through the RFC or the change process. That's exactly correct.
Here's a good one. I'm sure you'll enjoy this one, Greg. When the practice is simply to run wild and free and have zero discipline, are you saying that a big part of the job is to start changing culture to make – oh, we just got another question and it jumped. Are you saying that a big part of the job is to start changing culture to make change management produce reasonable outcomes?
Yeah, that's exactly it. When you have Wild West, you know, see, organizations mature over time. You know, you start out as either a startup company or as a mom and pop shop, and everybody's involved with everything. And you know, Jane is the expert on the Unix systems, and she sets up systems, and nobody questions her because she's dedicated and she does it right each and every time. But when Jane becomes one of 30 sysadmins in a Fortune 500 company, that no longer meets either your regulatory or your compliance expectations, and actually puts your organization in a great risk. But you haven't changed the culture from when we were a little mom and pop shop and people sit around the coffee pot and talk about the good old days. Remember when we stayed up all night and we implemented those changes, and by golly, we saved this business, and that's why we're here today. And those are good moments. Those are stories that make your organization what they are. So as a change manager, you may very well be perceived as damaging the culture and not valuing what we've done all these years to make this organization great. So that's where I'm exactly saying that. You need to work within the context of your culture. Now, you said change the culture, which is one of the most difficult things that you can do within an organization. And I write quite a bit about that elsewhere. Don't try to change your culture. Change behaviors. Just say, hey, because we care about our customers, this new behavior is we're going to document changes just so that everybody can see it. If nothing else, you know those guys at the service desk? They're the last ones to know anything. Let's respect our colleagues by at least letting them know that this change is coming. And so you start changing the culture by changing the acceptable behaviors, which is a lot easier to grab. But you're exactly right. That's the enormity of the task before you. That's why I say all of those great swim lane flow charts about how processes work, I really de-emphasize that because culture and the attitudes and the behaviors of the organization are going to do far more challenging to you than the process itself.
Super. We have some great questions here. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. Do you have any recommendations for applications to obtain or purchase to assist people with new change management to help make the process more structured and consistent?
That's a really good question, and I'm probably going to balk at it and give you an unsatisfactory answer. Look, there's a lot of really good ITSM tools, and as soon as I mention one, then I'll get 16 emails from a bunch of other vendors. All of them are good, quite frankly. Some are better than others, but they all do a good job of this. But quite frankly, my recommendation is to start with very, very basic tools. So that when you're implementing change or just getting started, your focus is in on how are we actually doing this. Frankly, believe it or not, I do it on a spreadsheet. And the organization that I'm working for right now, I am literally, our next cab will be this Thursday, our second cab. And I've done this before, and we're using a spreadsheet, and that's all we're doing. And the reason I do that is because we can make changes very quickly to the tool so that the tool isn't driving our behaviors. We're driving how we do this, and then the tool is adjusted to fit us. And then when you've gotten to a certain level of maturity, then you'll know what you need in a tool. Then you'll be able to tell, hey, this tool is better for us than this tool over here. So I do recommend starting out very, very small.
Great, thank you. Regarding regression documentation and testing documentation, how detailed have you generally seen this type of information? Is it better to consider key points or full step-by-step documentation of end-user testing and regression steps if needed?
I usually don't get asked that question because testing is one of those things that many organizations either don't do or don't do a good job of it. So I love this question. My preference would be that under the surface, so the tip of the iceberg is what change management actually is looking at. So we're really mostly interested in, are you effectively testing the application or the service that you're testing, and will a pass-fail or a pass with percentage, will it accurately reflect that service is going to perform in operations or in production the way it does in test or development? That's what I'm interested in. I've seen organizations that take pages and pages of test results to the cab to demonstrate, yep, we've tested it, and here's all the results. I would advise against that. What I would want to do is have a subject matter expert come and tell me that we've defined a test process early in the development cycle. It's passed all of those, and we believe it's safe to move forward. That would be my preference. And I'm not downplaying the details. I love that question. Whoever asked that question, you're an expert at testing and service validation. And I'd love to have more people like you in an organization. But keep in mind that we're really interested in managing risk, and so your effective testing is going to advise me what level of risk do I have.
Great, thank you. This is a really straightforward, short question. Wouldn't most changes be routine or standard?
Well, so let's be clear on terms. So, and the words don't actually matter. A standard change is what we in the business use to describe a change that's already been pre-approved. So standard changes don't go through the normal change process. They don't go to the cab. They aren't reviewed by the change manager or the subject matter expert. We've already looked at the process and say, if you build your servers, if you add tables, if you deploy PCs or add users following this process that we've already reviewed, then we believe that the risk level of that is acceptable. Just do that. So in that regard, I suppose maybe you're catching me on. I said most changes should be normal. Maybe what you're saying is, look, if you have a lot of standard changes, you're doing hundreds of those maybe an hour, and you're right. So if that's what you mean, you're absolutely right. But what I mean, the kind of changes that are coming to your change advisory board, most of them should be a normal change, meaning it's big enough it needs to be reviewed. It's unique enough that it's something that we're going to have to actually stop and take a look at.
Thanks so much, Greg. We couldn't get to every question, but thanks for all your questions. And just a reminder here, we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar, What is a Call Storm and How Do We Prevent One? That's next month. Thanks to Greg Sanker and to everyone who attended today. This webcast is copyright 2017 by United Business Media, LLC. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by HDI, which is solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers who are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of HDI, thank you for your time and have a great day.